Okay. Hello everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself at the first place. My name is Sahar Hamoud. I am a PhD candidate at the Doctoral School of Health Sciences, University of Pécs in Hungary. Today, I will present a sub-study of my PhD research entitled Patient Education on Infection Control, a Systematic Review. Our paper was published in the American Journal of Infection Control. If you felt more interested to read it, here is it. And these are the points that we will discuss today in this presentation. So, to start with the background, healthcare-associated infections are the most adverse event faced by patients worldwide. The CDC estimates that 5 to 10% of patients inside hospitals acquire healthcare-associated infections. The elevated rates of healthcare-associated infections due to multi-drug resistant organisms have led to increased morbidity and mortality, making healthcare-associated infections a patient safety concern. To improve the quality of provided care, many suggestions were given to engage the patient and empower them in their own process of care. Patient empowerment has earlier been known as patient involvement, patient partnership, and patient-centered care. Patient empowerment means permitting the patients to achieve the information and build the skills to make decisions and contribute to their own care process. Later on, suggestions on engaging the patient in infection control were given after showing that patients and family members can aid in preventing the transmission of healthcare-associated infections. Additionally, the CDC recommends patient and family education on infection control by mentioning in the CDC guidelines about isolation precautions that were published in 2007, points about patient and family education. Also, the WHO suggested conducting researches on engagement of patients and their family members in a way to control healthcare-associated infections. Now, despite these improvements and suggestions and recommendations, assessing patient education on infection control in hospitals is poorly investigated. So this systematic review also, up to our knowledge, no systematic reviews were done to assess patient education on infection control in hospitalized patients. So this systematic review was meant to address this gap in research. So our main objective was to identify all the available studies in the literature that assessed hospitalized patients' education on infection control, summarize them, and compare their results. What was our method? First, this review was prepared and is reported according to PRISMA guidelines. Concerning the inclusion criteria, all the studies that assessed patient education in hospitalized or discharged patients were included. Those studies not focusing on specific diseases, for example, tuberculosis, HIV, etc. Those studies assessing patients' education on infection control, irrespective of the instrument that was used. And those studies assessing patient education, including the following infection control measures: hand hygiene, respiratory hygiene, healthcare-associated infections, the risks, CLEPSI, COTI, VAP, SSI, reason for isolation, isolation precaution, and the use of personal protective equipment. On the other hand, the exclusion criteria were qualitative studies, since they lack numerical numbers, also studies assessing the impact of education without measuring the education itself. So if we didn't have a measurement for the education itself, this study was excluded, and also studies conducted on the general population. Concerning the search strategy and the study selection, first a search strategy was built, and then we searched PubMed, Embase, and CNAL from inception until May 6, 2020. No restrictions were applied to the research, for example, study design, language, date of publication. And for the gray literature, unpublished papers were searched in open gray, and also hand searching on the reference list was done by the first author, which is me. Concerning the study selection, it was done by the first and the second authors independently. Concerning the reporting quality assessment, it was done according to stroke checklist, also by the second and the first author independently. For the data extraction, we developed a form according to the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Intervention, and also the data extraction was done by two authors independently. The results now. Figure 1 shows the Prisma flow diagram of the study selection process. So as we can see to the left, that around 6,700 articles were retrieved from the search of the 3 databases, as well as 26 papers from other additional resources. So after removing the duplicates, after screening the title and the abstracts, we had 152 papers that were eligible for the full text assessment. After the full text assessment, 127 were excluded, and the final included papers in this systematic reviews were 25. Table 1 shows a summary of the study's characteristics. To the left, we can see that we had different types or designs of the studies. The majority were cross-sectional. We had 3 pre- and post-interventional studies, 2 quasi-experimental, and 1 cohort study. To the right, we can see that the studies were from all over the world. And concerning the years of publications, they were between 1998 and 2020. Now we can see the education on healthcare-associated infections was investigated in 8 studies. So in white, we can see that when receiving information or education on the risks of healthcare-associated infections, the percentage of education ranged between 4.8 and 30. When educating on healthcare-associated infection, the percentages in purple ranged between 15, 22, and the maximum was 34.5%. Second, education on CLEPSI was investigated in only 1 study. In this study, 46% of patients received flyers about CLEPSI and 76% received information on the risks of having a central line. Third, education on surgical site infections was investigated in 2 studies. In the first study, we can see that around 84% discussed surgical site infections with their healthcare providers, and 60% received flyers. And also concerning receiving information, 54% in the first, and in the second, 95% received written and 93% verbal education. Fourth, education on hand hygiene. It was the mostly investigated in 12 studies. So we'll start in white. We can see when receiving information about hand hygiene, the percentages ranged between 3.6 to a maximum of 55%. In brown, we can see when having flyers about hand hygiene in 2 studies, the percentage was the same, around 29%. And in purple, when receiving reminders to wash our hands, the percentages ranged between 1%, 5%, and the maximum was 74% in only 1 study. Fifth, education on isolation rationale, precautions, and the use of personal protective equipment was investigated in 3 studies. When educating on the reason for isolation, the percentages were between 46%, 36%, and 79%. When educating on the isolation precautions, it was 40%, and educating on the use of personal protective equipment, 82%. Education on respiratory hygiene was only investigated in 1 study with 21%, and finally, education on other infection control measures were investigated in 2 studies. The first study investigated education on hygiene measures to prevent UTIs with 28%, and the second investigated receiving information on infection control methods and on the organization of infection control in hospitals with 10% and 6% respectively. Table 2 shows the data collection tools used and their psychometric properties. So to the left, we can see that most of the studies used questionnaires. Only 1 study used an audit tool, and 1 study retrieved the data from patient medical records. Concerning the validity, only 4 studies mentioned that the questionnaires were assessed for the validity. 1 study only said that the questionnaire was already validated, and 2 studies stated that no validation was done, while all the other studies did not mention anything regarding the validity. Concerning the reliability, only 2 studies mentioned the internal consistencies value via Cronbach alpha, while all the other 23 studies did not mention anything related to the reliability. Table 3 shows the reporting quality assessment using Strobe checklist. Briefly, the abstracts and the introductions were all well reported. The methods, we had around 3 studies, for example, did not mention the dates of the periods of data collection. 4 did not report the variables. Only 4 studies described how the study size was arrived at. Concerning the results, for example, 5 studies did not report the demographics of the participants. Only 2 indicated the number of participants with missing data. And finally, concerning the discussion, only 6 studies did not report the study limitations, and only 12 discussed the generalizability of the results. To come to the discussion part, so we noticed that when educating on healthcare-associated infections, a low percentage was noticed in all the studies, except in the studies that assessed education on CLEPSI and on surgical site infections. And since these patients are at a higher risk of acquiring healthcare-associated infections, we believe that they are given more attention by their healthcare workers. When educating on hand hygiene, also a low percentage was recognized in 11 studies, and only 1 study had a high level, despite the fact that hand hygiene is the most effective approach to prevent the transmission of healthcare-associated infections. When educating on isolation rationale, precaution, and the use of personal protective equipment, only 1 study had a high percentage of education, but here we should say that the sample size of the 3 studies was small, so we believe that this might have affected the result. And finally, when educating on other infection control measures, all the studies had low percentage of education. Given the low percentage of education on infection control in most of the studies, we believe that patient education on infection control is not being adequately done inside hospitals. Only 2 studies were found to assess patient education on more than 1 measures, and this highlights the necessity of having more research that aim at assessing patient education on several infection control measures in 1 study. This research might lead to a validated and standardized questionnaire that can be further used by other researchers. Concerning the reporting quality assessment, as we said, abstracts and introduction were well reported in all studies, while several gaps were found in reporting the methods, results, and the discussion. Of course, our review have strength and limitation. So first, the strength. This was the first systematic review to identify studies that assessed hospitalized patient education on infection control. Another strength is that our search was done without any restrictions regarding language, date of publication, design, etc. And also, all the included studies have an international scope, as we saw in Table 2. Nevertheless, our systematic review have some weaknesses or limitations. One of them is that few data were not available even after contacting the authors, like, for example, the mean age in some studies. And also, another limitation was excluding the studies that assessed patient education in general population and in specific diseases and qualitative studies. And these studies might have included some infection control measures that are related to our variables. To sum up, the present review reveals a low percentage of patient education on infection control measures. Only 2 studies assessed patient education on more than 1 measure, and this results highlight a gap in the present assessment of infection control education and involvement in infection control. So hospitals have to emphasize the importance of patient engagement and education on infection control, and this can be done by always reminding the healthcare workers how important it is to engage and empower our patients, by encouraging the patients themselves to engage themselves in a discussion process with the healthcare workers, by seeking information, by asking questions the healthcare workers. And finally, for future studies, we encourage to conduct a review concerning education of family members as well. These are the references that I have used in this study. And I would like to thank my co-authors, my supervisor, for their contribution in the systematic review. Also, I would like to thank University of Page for funding my participation in this conference. And finally, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I am ready to answer your questions, if any. Thank you so much.